And welcome to High School Physics Explained, and today I'm going to look at the Medical Physics elective of the 2016 HSC exam paper. And so as I go through each of the questions, I'm going to go not only through the answers, but I'm also going to go through various exam techniques, highlighting certain aspects of the question that are really important to understand as you attempt various HSC style questions. So I sort of call it like the metadata or the meta-narrative, the underlying principles embedded into the question. I've linked a copy of this paper in the description, and I strongly urge you that either A, you attempt the whole paper in about 40 minutes, then go through my answers, or secondly, you pause at each question, do the question, and then listen to how I mark that question. It's going to be really much more beneficial to you if you do that. So let's get started. The first question, part A, is what are the differences between hard and soft X-rays? And secondly, account for the widespread use of X-rays to create images of human limbs. Now let's have a look at part A. Part A is only worth 2 marks, and we're interested in differences between hard and soft X-rays. Before I actually go through the marking guidelines as published by the Board of Studies, or NISA as it's now known, I want you to understand, first of all, we're looking at more than one difference. So in order to get 2 marks, you need to provide 2 differences, and it's between hard and soft X-rays. So you need to discuss in terms of hard X-rays and soft X-rays. You need to mention both. So let's have a look at the marking guidelines. It says that you need to identify a property of hard or soft X-rays, and that gives you 1 mark. But the fact that this question is the very first question, generally speaking, the structure of the HSC exam is that the first questions are generally meant to be a little easier than the later questions. But in order to actually get the answer correct, you need to provide differences between hard and soft X-rays. So one aspect that you could look at in terms of hard X-rays is in terms of energy. So if we look at X-rays and they are hard, then generally speaking, they have a higher frequency. That means if they have a higher frequency, their energy due to E equals HF is higher. Now, if you simply say they have a higher energy level, that is sufficient. Of course, you need to then also say for X-rays that are soft, they have a low energy as a result because the frequency is a little lower. So now I've actually identified one difference between hard and soft X-rays. Another aspect of hard and soft X-rays is that the hard X-rays basically have greater penetration than soft X-rays. Now notice here, I could say hard X-rays have greater penetrations, soft X-rays have less penetration. Because I'm mentioning greater penetration than soft X-rays, I've clearly differentiated between the two. But there's a second difference. I could also mention frequency, but often in answering that, frequency is aligned with energy. So what I'd rather actually see a good response saying, for example, about the penetration. A third example, though you only need to provide 2, is that hard X-rays provide higher resolution images than soft X-rays. So there's a third one. Let's have a look at part 2. It says, account for the widespread use of X-rays to create images of the human limbs. Let's pull this question apart. It's about the use of X-rays, not the production. It's about the use of them. It's about producing images, but notice here it says human limbs. Let me make it absolutely clear. When the HSC examiner or the exam committee write questions, no words are really wasted. It's not, this line of human limbs is not a throwaway line. You need to actually refer to why X-rays are useful for images of human limbs. So one good way of responding to this is to say, well, they produce high resolution images, which is fantastic. Okay, so there's a use. Because it's high resolution, they identify bones, which is fantastic because the bones are really white in X-rays. Therefore, detect things such as fractures in limbs. Notice what I'm doing now is that in responding to my answer, I'm referring to the human limb aspect. You'll notice that it's a state a reason for the widespread use. Now, I've done that aspect there, but that only gives me two. What I've discussed is only gives me two so far. So I'm needing more, in this case, the widespread use. So I'm needing, in this case, multiple reasons for the widespread use. Well, the fact is, of course, is that X-rays are cheap. That's another reason why they're used frequently. So now what I've done is I've provided two reasons for widespread use, and I've referred directly to the aspect of fractures in limbs. So you'll notice here when you interpret these marking guidelines, and you can download these from NISA or from the Board of Studies, is that when you look at the differences between the statements and the marking criteria, it helps you to identify what the examiner or what the marker is looking for. Let's move on to the next question. It says, describe the piezoelectric effect and its application in ultrasound imaging. Again, it's only worth 3 marks. I hope you've attempted the question, or pause right now before you look at the answers here. Again, let's interpret the question. This is a describe question. So what is it not? Well, it's not an explain question. We're not interested in cause and effect here. So when you're thinking of the piezoelectric effect, we're not needing a fulsome discussion about the application of an alternating voltage which causes distortions and so forth. We're generally wanting a more of a description rather than an explanation. Secondly, it's about its application to ultrasound imaging. You can't just say what the piezoelectric effect is without referral to why it's important into ultrasound imaging. So let's have a look at the marking guidelines. You notice for one, all you have to do is provide a feature of the piezoelectric effect. If you provide a description of the piezoelectric effect or its application in ultrasound, you get 2. But if you do both, you get 3. Now, what are features of the piezoelectric effect? Well, of course, you produce high frequency or ultrasonic sound. There's a feature of the piezoelectric effect. It involves using crystals and they get distorted. That is a feature. But it's not a description. We need to go further than that. And so when we talk about a description of the piezoelectric effect, ultimately what we're saying is, hey, well, let's apply an alternating voltage to the crystal, and that will produce high frequency sound. Now there's a bit more of a description. Of course, the reverse is true. If we actually have piezoelectric crystals experiencing high frequency sounds, they're going to get distorted and thereby produce an alternating potential across them, and therefore we can measure that. So in other words, by applying electrical energy onto the crystal, we can produce sound energy. As a result of the reverse of this, we can have sound energy producing electrical energy. That's really useful. At this stage, I've only answered it as a 2. So how is its application in ultrasound useful? Well, then I need to say something to the effect of is I can fire these ultrasonic sounds into the human body, which is going to reflect off tissue, and I'm able to pick that reflection off and therefore provide useful imaging data from the ultrasound. Now I've made that connection, and that would give me a 3. Moving on to part 2 of part B, we now have a question that is a bit more involved, and we are progressively getting a little bit more difficult. In this case, the question says, an ultrasound pulse leaves the transducer and passes from the gel through soft tissue and bone as shown, and a table of acoustic impedances. Describe what happens to the intensity of the ultrasound pulse at each boundary. Use calculations to support your answer. Before I go into the marking guidelines and before I go discuss the final answer, I want to make a particular point here. The fact that there are numerical aspects to the question is begging that you need to do some calculations. In this particular example, you're lucky. It's actually telling you, hey, produce calculations to support your answer. But the reality is, I've seen time and time again in previous exams, this statement is not necessarily there, but numerical data is given. Well, the expectation is that you use the numerical data and you use the diagram to support your answer. So we're interested in describing what happens to the intensity of the ultrasound. So let's again look at the marking guidelines. The marking guideline says provide some relevant information. The HSC exam is not wanting to take marks away from you. So if you show some understanding, some learning of anything to do with the topic, we generally look for opportunities to give you marks. So here's a clear example. We'll give you 1 if you provide something that's relevant to the question. But in order to get 2 or more, you need to provide some relevant calculations. Notice here now that no calculations means the best you can do is 1. You need some calculations to move from 1 into 2, 3. The difference between 2 and 3 is that 2 only provides some relevant calculations and or shows an understanding of what happens, where we clearly have in 3 describing what happens to the intensity at each boundary. What is all that about? You remember, of course, that the formula that we use is that the intensity of what's reflected divided by the initial intensity, often referred to as I naught, is equal to the differences between the acoustic impedances divided by the sum of the acoustic impedances squared. And there are 2 boundaries. The first boundary is from gel to soft tissue, and then soft tissue to bone. The fact that all 3 are given means that you need to discuss both boundaries. Now the first thing you notice, of course, is that the acoustic impedance is identical for the gel and soft tissue. So you need to make a statement that there is no reflection at that boundary. Because when you do this calculation for the gel, then I naught R over I naught clearly was going to be equal to 0. So you're going to get maximum transmission. Because if you get 0% reflection, you get 100% transmission. You need to make that point. So for example, if this is all you do, you've provided some relevant calculation, and you showed some understanding what happens, this would get you a 2. However, we need the second part. The fact is that you're going to get some reflection from soft tissue and bone interface. And in that case, the IR over I naught value is going to equal 6.732 by 10 to the power of 6 minus 1.632 by 10 to the power of 6 all squared. On the bottom you're going to get those same 2 values, but you're going to add them. Doing that calculation you get 0.3718, and that actually means an approximate 37% reflection. Have I addressed the question? Yes, but we want to know what happens to the intensity, so it would be a stronger statement to say therefore 63% is transmitted. This gives you the 4 marks for 3. Let's move on to part C. It says contrast the use of Doppler ultrasound imaging with the use of computed axial tomography CAT imaging, and in your answer include an example of how each is used. Again, let me look at the meta-narrative before I look at the answer. It says, first of all, contrast. What contrasting means is describe both but highlight their differences. If this was compare, then we need to look at similarities and differences, but it's contrast, so we're only interested in the contrast. The second aspect is about the use of Doppler ultrasound imaging. We are not interested in the production of Doppler ultrasound imaging, nor interested in the formation of the CAT scan imaging. It's about their use. And finally, in your answer, you need to include an example of how it is used. And because we're contrasting, you can't really use the one example for both. So you really need to tie in their use with the reason why we actually have differences in the 2 imaging. Let's have a look at the marking guideline, and I also want to particularly make a strong highlight. Doppler is absolutely important. In order for you to get maximum marks, you need to refer to Doppler ultrasound imaging. Let's have a look at the marking guidelines to see what the examiner is looking for. As I said before, it's providing some relevant information for 1 mark. So show some learning in this area, you'll get a mark. But in order to get a 2, you need to outline a use of either technology. An outline means sketch in general terms. So let's say the person says, oh, CAT scans help identify broken bones because they provide high resolution images. That would give you 2 marks. They might say Doppler ultrasound allows us to detect motion of blood flow. That's a 2-mark response. But in order to get a 3, you need to outline a use of each technology. Do you remember what I said about contrasting the differences between the Doppler ultrasound and normal ultrasound? Well, if a student were to discuss ultrasound alone to produce, let's say, a baby image, and then talk also about CAT scans produce breakages and bones, how many marks would they get? 2, because they're not outlining the use of Doppler ultrasound. In order to get 4 though, they need to contrast the uses. Now we've got multiple uses of CAT scan imaging and ultrasound imaging and provide an example of each is used. And really, in terms of the use, if we're going to divide the 2 up, often a table can be very useful. So if we divide our table into ultrasound, Doppler and CAT scans, first of all, Doppler ultrasound gives us functional information, whereas CAT scans give us structural information. Functional means I can detect blood flow because Doppler ultrasound looks at measuring the motion of liquids. CAT scans are good for hard and soft tissue differentiation, high contrast imaging. Doppler ultrasound, of course, is not high contrast, but remember, we're interested in their use. Functional versus structural. Motion of blood versus hard and soft tissue difference. I've now contrasted the uses. But would this give me 4 marks? No. I need to go further because I need to show an example of how it's used. So I might say, well, that allows us to determine cardiac issues. I could also talk about looking at blood flow in the arteries, blockages, and so forth. CAT scans, hard and soft tissue, I'm looking at fractures. I'm looking at issues such as tumours. That's another thing, because if there is a differentiation in the soft tissue of the tumour with that of the surrounding tissue, I'm able to identify tumours. So you can see now I've contrasted the uses. I've given an example. This would give me 4 marks. So let's look at part D. It says describe how positron emission tomography or PET scanning is used in diagnosis. In your answer, refer to the interaction of the positrons and electrons. This is a describe question. It is not an explain question. We are not interested in the cause and effect of how the actual positrons are produced. You should know is due to the decay of the fluorine into oxygen as an example, and by release of a positron. So let's have a look at the marking guidelines. 1 and 2 are simple identification responses. So identifications, but not going into the higher order of descriptions. Even a 3 is outline, which is sketch in general terms. So what's the difference between outlines and describes? Outlines is much more vague. A student who has a good understanding of how PET scans are used will provide key scientific terms that shows they understand this with reasonable depth. So what would an answer look like? Well, first of all, where PET scans is about the use of radiopharmaceuticals, which of course produce positrons. But why do we want to use them? Because we're interested in looking at metabolic processes. In other words, PET scan is all about function or functional information. If we have a radiopharmaceutical, so for example, FDG is utilized in the brain because it is a glucose analog, we're going to understand how the brain works. It's about metabolism. And the more metabolism going on, the more of the radiopharmaceutical is going to be absorbed there. So we can identify, for example, cancers. If there is a lot of cell growth, as it is in cancers, you're going to get a lot of usage of the radiopharmaceutical. Now let's go into the details. So what happens is the patient is injected with the radiopharmaceutical that accumulates, and there will be a release of positrons. Those positrons will annihilate with local electrons. Notice I'm now talking about the interaction of positrons and electrons. So we have the positrons plus the electrons. They annihilate and produce energy in terms of gamma radiation. That gamma radiation is measured by use of a gamma camera, and of course allows the doctor or the radiographer to identify the location of the high level of metabolism of that radiopharmaceutical. If I were to change this into explain, then I'd need to say, okay, why is this gamma radiation produced? Well, of course, that's equal to E equals mc squared. What more do I need to say if I were to say explain? Well, my gamma burst, of course, would be traveling in the opposite direction. Why? Because of the law of conservation of momentum and the law of conservation of energy, to explain why I get 2 gamma photons traveling in 180 degrees. But of course, we're interested in description, so the fact is that is not necessary at this particular point. We're only in a description. And finally, we come to the last question in the elective, part E. Explain how principles of physics are applied in magnetic resonance imaging. Before we look at the question, I make a couple of comments. Number 1, the question that is normally the most difficult question in the elective is the last question, and it's meant to be so because this is obviously the culmination of a whole series of questions, and they progressively get more difficult. Secondly, the question is usually worth more marks. In this case, it's worth 6. I've seen final questions that are worth 5 and 7, and I've seen even 8-mark questions in some of the other subjects, such as biology. Let's go through it also, looking at the question closely. The first word here is explain. So now we're looking at a higher level of thinking, a higher level response. We're no longer just identifying or outlining or describing. We're now explaining. And what is explain? It's about cause and effect. So if your response does not show clear linkage between cause and effect, you're not going to get 4 marks. The issue here too is about the topic. The topic is magnetic resonance imaging, or commonly known as MRI. As you know, MRI is quite an involved process. Heck, I've created a series of videos to discuss MRI simply because there are so many facets to understand. Whether you start at nuclear spin, net spin, go on to precession, go on to knockdown, radio frequencies, and the like, and the magnetic field, and so forth. If you were to provide a very detailed, clear response in terms of what happens in an MRI production, then you could say you know this well, but you wouldn't be addressing this question, because this question is about how the principles of physics are applied. And what are the physics principles? Well, they're principles such as conservation of energy. They're principles such as resonance. We could talk about electromagnetic induction. We could talk about superconductors. We could talk about spin. These are all physics principles. And so if you were to answer this fully in terms of just what happens during an MRI, you're not going to get many marks because you need to actually address the principles of physics. So it needs a much deeper understanding of physics in general rather than just a very thorough knowledge of MRI. So let's have a look at the marking guidelines and then identify some features of a strong response. The first thing I want you to notice in the marking guidelines is that we get progressively deeper order thinking as we go up. So we've got here provide some relevant information. I've told you that as long as you show something, MRIs use strong magnetic fields to cause your atoms to align, then you could say that's a 1-mark response. But we go from provide some information, first to identify, then to outline, at least in terms of features of MRIs. Then we go into describe. Then we've got some relations of principles to the use of MRI, but the ultimate verb here is explain. Cause and effect. If your response doesn't do explain, you can see the best you're going to get is 5. What principles do we want to discuss? If you look again at the marking guideline, is that you need more than one. The fact is that the question suggests so. You need to refer to at least two because the plural tells us you need more than one. It's principles. In my response, I'm going to highlight 3 I could possibly use, though only 2 are necessary. The first is spin, and the second one is resonance. I can tie in this with law of conservation of energy, and I could also touch on superconductors. Before I go on, if I just simply identify 2 of these principles, automatically I can get myself a 3. I have identified principles of physics. If I've just identified a single principle, the best is I get in 2. And by the way, do you remember what you might do right out of full response of how an MRI works and you failed to actually mention the physics principles? How much will you get? All you can get is 2. Because as soon as you don't mention any principle of physics, you're excluded from any mark higher or equal to 3. But we want to, of course, see if we can get ourselves from 3, 4 to 5 and eventually to 6. Well, spin, you need to talk first of all the fact that we have nuclear spin, and that of course leads to net spin of a nucleus. The effect of this nuclear spin is that my little hydrogen nuclei are going to behave like magnets. They're going to have what we call a magnetic moment. Then if you place them in a very large, strong magnetic field, that will cause them to align. And it will cause them to precess. And that is really important principle for MRI. The fact that I have hydrogen nuclei precessing about a axis which is aligned with a strong magnetic field, which is all due to the fact that net spin means they have a magnetic moment. There's that cause and effect. That is a good explanation of a principle in the importance of MRI. Let's have a look at resonance. Resonance, of course, is where you fire a radio frequency or via any energy with a certain frequency that is the same as the natural frequency of the substance. And resonance happens at many levels. But in terms of MRI, our resonance occurs by firing a radio frequency pulse at the Larmor frequency. Now, what's the Larmor frequency? The Larmor frequency, of course, is the frequency of precession. And so now if I have a radio frequency at Larmor frequency, what I now get is resonance. Now at the moment, I've just simply described it. I need to talk about cause and effects. What's happening is, well, I've got energy absorbed. That is really important in terms of it. I've got high energy absorbed, and so that of course means my nuclei which are precessing are going to be knocked down. Now I've now done an explanation. I haven't actually gone into anything more apart from that. And that's all that I need to do. But I could go further. When the radio frequency is turned off, so I've got radio frequency off, we know that we have relaxation. Now relaxation means that we have a radio frequency emitted from the hydrogen nuclei. That is consistent with the law of conservation of energy. So now what I've done is I've tied in the principle of law of conservation of energy and said, well, hold on, if I excite or place my hydrogen nuclei at a high energy state, remember this is due to the fact of resonance, that then they're going to release that energy in terms of radio frequency of the same value, because that is consistent with the law of conservation of energy. I've now explained law of conservation of energy in the context of MRI. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3 principles I've now explained. The third one, of course, is the superconductors. And superconductors are, of course, metals below their critical temperature, and that means they have no resistance, which means I have very high magnetic fields. And why is that important? Well, I need strong magnetic fields if I'm going to align my hydrogen nuclei in such a way that I'm going to provide the precessional frequency that is equivalent to radio frequencies. So now I've done the cause and effect again. What if I only talked about nuclear spin and they align and precess? That is, I failed to mention this guy. Well, I've done not explain, I've just relayed principles. As soon as I do that, I no longer qualify for a 6. What if I talk about the fact that radio frequency at the Larmor frequency and they get knocked down? Well, I've not talked about the cause and effect. Even if I mention the word resonance, I need to mention that energy is absorbed. And so therefore, without this part, I'm not going to get to the explain. Finally, and I won't deal with superconductors, is if I talk about the fact that they relax and release a radio frequency that is equal to the initial radio frequency, I have described the principle, but I've not explained it in terms of law of conservation of energy. So hopefully you can see now what is needed to get a high result. I want to finish by highlighting a couple of the issues I've raised as the meta-narrative. Number 1, make sure you know your verbs. Number 2, read your question carefully. For example, are there plurals? Okay, look at all the phrases. No phrases is just put in for the heck of it. They mean something. Number 3, are there numbers? Make sure you include calculations and do them properly and use them in your argument. And finally, if you read the question, read it in such a way to see what it's asking. Don't presume what it's asking without reading the question properly. And structure your response with detail. Though I haven't referred to this, it's really important that you spend a few moments to structure your responses. It's well worth your while to spend a minute out of, let's say, 8 minutes to do a 6-mark question to just plan your response and think about what you're going to write rather than going straight into it. Anyway guys, I hope that has helped you with medical physics. I'm Paul from High School Physics Explained. Bye for now.